好，欢迎收看由星岛日报美西版的新电视为您打造的三藩市湾区本地专题节目《新电视的独家策划》，我是星岛的资深记者和新闻主播明月。因前华裔众议员邱信福被市长布里德任命为市府律师一职，那三藩市呢即将于4月19号的星期二举行特别选举了，选出新的加州第17区选区的众议员。那该选区覆盖了三藩市东部地区，包括北岸区、华部、南市场街、田德隆区、米慎区、卡斯楚区、金银岛以及保多拉等地区。那因该地区呢，除了三藩市的经济命脉等地之外呢，还有包括华裔、跨性别族群等多元少数族群，其中除了40%的白人人口呢，亚裔占足了30%。因此呢，这一职位对咱们亚裔选民来说是非常重要的。为了让该区的华裔和亚裔选民呢更加了解两位候选人的状况，那我特别为您对他们进行了面对面的专访，希望帮助您选出心中最佳的众议员。
Sure. Well, it's great to be with you. My name is Matt Haney. Yohai Young Chima.
My name is David Campos.甘大为.
I serve as a member of the Board of Supervisors here in San Francisco. I represent downtown San Francisco, the South of Market, Market Street area, Mission Bay, Rincon Hill, and Treasure Island. I've served as the chair of the Budget and Finance Committee, making sure we make investments in our small businesses and our neighborhoods and public safety. I've been in elected office in San Francisco for 9 years in service of the people of San Francisco. I also am an attorney and worked in housing law and have been an educator teaching at the university level, and I've been a strong champion of the Chinese community throughout my entire career here in San Francisco.
I am an immigrant, and in many respects my experience as an immigrant really shapes how I see the world. And in that sense, even though I'm not Chinese, I think that my experience as an immigrant is very similar to the experience of so many Chinese immigrants. I got into Stanford University and got a scholarship to Stanford. Also, was a very good student and got into Harvard Law School. And so, for my parents, getting an education was really the embodiment of the American dream. And that's why for me, as a politician and as an elected official, I'm always looking out for the interests of immigrants, of all kinds, because I think that, that's what this country is. It's a country of immigrants. I believe that this is a very important time because we're still in a pandemic, and I think that we need to have someone who comes from these communities, these diverse communities. I think that having someone who is an immigrant in this role is really important because immigrants have been suffering a lot during the pandemic. They have been targeted, during the pandemic, blamed for it if you're API, but also you have a lot of these communities, the workers were on the front lines during the pandemic and they suffered a lot, higher infection rates, more people died if you were Latino, if you're black, if you're a person of color. And I think that this is the time for that perspective to be represented because as an immigrant, I understand the challenges that our communities face, the challenges with the language, the challenges with the education system, with the public safety system, the challenges, people paying attention to your community, understanding your community. And that's why I think it's important at this time in the history of San Francisco that an immigrant represents San Francisco in the state legislature. We haven't had that in a very long time. And I think that it's especially important for the east side of San Francisco that is so diverse to finally have someone who comes from those communities.
We have really huge challenges in our city and in our state. We don't have enough housing or affordable housing. We have members of our community who feel unsafe, who need to be protected, and for us to stand up with effective consequences to crime. We have to make sure that our state supports small businesses and that local businesses here, particularly coming out of COVID-19, can get the support that they need to be able to thrive. All of these things are things that we cannot do alone in San Francisco. We can't solve homelessness just in our city. We need other cities and counties and the state to do their part to get people off the streets. We need the state to give us more resources so that we could support our small businesses and raise the standards of living and quality of life for everyone. My track record has been somebody who has worked hard, who has delivered, who has brought people together for solutions, and I think that's something that I can bring to the state level and make sure I bring back resources for our city, that I fight for and stand up for the Chinese community and all residents of San Francisco, and I believe that I am the most prepared, the most qualified, and the most effective leader who is running for this office. Well, one is we need to build more housing and affordable housing. Housing is still far too expensive for everyone in our city. We aren't building enough affordable housing. We are not investing particularly for families and seniors, which are two populations that will be a big priority for me, and the state can provide additional funding for our city to be able to do that. Secondly, I'm going to work to make sure that residents are safe. We need more police and community policing, including police who speak Cantonese and who are reflective of the diversity of our city. That's something that I've done here and that we need to do in a broader way with the support from the state. We also need to have effective consequences for crime. People who are committing many crimes need to not be just cycled in and out of the system, but actually have consequences so that they stay off the streets, and if they need help, that they get help. With that, I'm going to work to confront AAPI hate. There has not been enough, I think, support from the state to confront API hate, to ensure that there are effective consequences to stand up to hate crimes. Another huge priority for me is going to be a support for our small businesses. Our small businesses are struggling to stay open. Many of them have lost revenue during the pandemic, and we need more grants from the state. We need to see taxes waived for small businesses. We need to make sure that Chinese and immigrant-owned small businesses have the support that they need with additional grants, and that they have a champion in Sacramento.
So having universal health care, that's going to be my top priority, because I think that there are many people who don't have access to quality, affordable health care right now. Second issue is a Green New Deal, having more environmental, pro-environmental policies that create green jobs, especially in certain neighborhoods. I think that California needs to invest in a Green New Deal, especially new technologies that move away from fossil fuels. The third thing is education. I think that we need to spend more money in education. Right now, we are in the bottom 10 in per pupil spending in education. We need to be in the top 10 in per pupil spending, and so a lot more money needs to be spent, and that's going to help San Francisco unify, because more funds will go to the local school system. Housing, we need to build more housing, but especially affordable housing, and that's really important, especially because you have the housing that's being built in this city, basically luxury housing that people in our communities cannot afford. And then, the other issue that I would talk about in terms of the state is public safety, making sure that we address, that we have policing that is more community oriented. continuing to fight hate crimes and making sure that we have the resources to serve the needs of the API community is going to be my top priority, making sure that we protect this community, that we give them resources, and that anyone who commits a hate crime is held accountable. Second, public safety beyond hate crimes, just making sure that we have more community policing, that we have police officers who understand these communities, that come from these communities, that speak the language, and I'm going to provide funding at the state level so that police departments throughout the state can recruit people from these communities. So members of the Chinese community, of the Korean community, of the Vietnamese community, to make sure that they are members of these police forces so that they are connected to the communities. The third thing is education. And I think that it's really important that we prioritize education and not only increasing funding for public schools K through 12, but also college. I believe that college should be free to anyone in California who wants it. In my view, if you're a good student and you want to get a higher education, the state should invest in you and make it free. And I think that California has enough money to do that. The fourth thing would be small businesses. I think that we need to do more to support small businesses, especially coming out of the pandemic. I believe that we need to provide more financial assistance. And I would do something like the legacy business that we did in San Francisco at the statewide level. And I think that many API-owned businesses would benefit from that help, that support. And then in terms of the API community, the other thing that I would talk about are issues around seniors and making sure that we address issues around poverty. There are still many seniors that are struggling in the state, and I want to provide services to them, and especially many API seniors who are having a hard time.
Well, I would say number one is safety. People in our city do not feel safe. They don't feel like crime is being taken seriously. Many of our seniors are afraid to walk down the street. There's been hate crimes, and so we need leaders who understand the concerns about safety. If people don't feel safe, then really there's little else that matters, and so safety is a top priority for the Chinese community. The second one that I would say would be housing. Everyone in our city is struggling to pay the expensive cost of housing. That includes people who own homes as well as people who rent. We need someone who is fighting both for people who own homes and for people who rent. It's too expensive for everyone in the city, and so housing is something that I know is a huge concern for the Chinese community. The other big one, which I talked about, is support for small businesses. Many Chinese residents own small businesses. They've struggled during the pandemic, and they need support from our government to make sure that we stand up to predatory lawsuits from the ADA, and also that we bring additional grants and assistance to our small businesses. And if I were to add a fourth one, I would say public schools. Public schools are really important to the Chinese community, and especially right now where we've had a public school system that has had a lot of issues, a lot of problems. We need leaders who step up and ensure there's high standards, that we fund our public schools, and that Chinese students are getting the support that they need in our schools. I've served on the Board of Education in our public schools. I visited all of the public schools in San Francisco and have fought for Chinese students in our schools, making sure that schools where there are a high percentage of Chinese students get additional funding, that we increase support for higher standards like for in computer science, that we make sure that we support Chinese language programs in our schools. I've been a champion in our schools during my time on the Board part of education. In addition to that, I represent a supervisor district with a very large Chinese population. I've championed support for them on affordable housing for seniors, on additional open space and parks, on supporting our small businesses, and on public safety, making sure we increase the number of police officers who are out on our streets, who are walking the beats, and who are helping to provide safety for areas that have high numbers of Chinese residents. My time as a chair of the Budget and Finance Committee, I've provided a lot of investments for Chinatown, for Visitation Valley, for the Bayview, for the Portola, for areas of Assembly District 17 where there are a lot of Chinese residents who need to access services, who are seniors and need to access programming. Those are priorities for me, and I made sure that we made those investments. So I have a very long track record with the Chinese community, and for that reason, I've been able to have the support of the Chinese American Democratic Club, Lee Democratic Club, many Chinese community leaders, and in the primary, in the areas where there were more Chinese voters, I did much better than my opponent. And I think that is because of the track record that I have with the community, the track record of delivering resources and support for Chinese residents.
It's very personal because I'm married to someone who is Asian, and we have been together, 26 years. And like I said, even though I'm not Asian, my experience as an immigrant is very similar to the experiences of Asian immigrants. But because of that personal side, I have taken it upon myself to help the Asian community. When I became a supervisor, I saw the need in this neighborhood. The Portola over the last few years has become more Asian, so you see more Chinese, especially immigrants that are families that are coming into this neighborhood. Is that the police officers who were serving the Portola did not speak Chinese at the time. And so I pushed the police department to make sure that you had Cantonese speakers walking the beat in the Portola. And that was a tough fight, because they couldn't find them, right? And we pushed really hard to make sure that that happened. If you may recall, the city passed the Twitter tax break. This is back in 2010, 2011. And we created the Legacy Business Program that actually provides funding to these small businesses. And an example of a business that benefited from that is the Chinese, the fortune cookie company in Chinatown, right? One of the first legacy businesses. When I was a lawyer for the school district, we worked on public education, and worked to improve the public school system, especially programs for English language learners, because even though people were doing well in the school system, many API students were doing well, English language learners were not, so we helped them. I worked very closely with then Rose Pack before she passed. She and I were very good friends, and she was a very strong ally, and she supported my candidacy back in 2014, by the way. And the reason is because she saw my commitment to the Chinese community. So we worked to provide funding to organizations in Chinatown that serve the community. We worked to provide funding for the Chinese hospital. We worked to serve seniors with meals programs for seniors, and always working with Rose to figure out how we could help the Chinese community, because she understood that because I was an immigrant that I understood them, so whenever she needed something in City Hall, she would always come to me to see how I could help the Chinese community. I think you have to know how to do both, and in some respects I have an experience doing that because I also play the role of being the vice chair of the California Democratic Party, where I am an officer of the entire statewide party. And what I want the API community to know is that not only am I going to push to protect the interests of the local San Francisco API community, but I want to focus on protecting the API community throughout this state. So let's use the example of hate crimes as an illustration of that. I think the state has to invest even more to fight hate crimes, not just in San Francisco, but statewide. You know, something that I did in San Francisco is that I created the cultural district to protect neighborhoods like the Mission. It kind of follows the model of Chinatown, you know, which has a lot of protections. I think that we need to do the same at the state level, and especially in some of the API communities in different parts of the state. We need to protect them so that they're not displaced, so that people are not pushed out of these neighborhoods and there isn't a lot of gentrification.
Well, with all of the challenges that we're facing here, there's support that the state can provide that can help us do more for the Chinese community. Much of the funding for housing and affordable housing comes from the state, and we need more of it, and we need it to be targeted to meet the needs of the Chinese community. That is something that I will focus on. For support for workers, for support for small businesses, there's a lot of resources that the state provides, but we need someone who will champion making sure that everyone has access to it, especially the Chinese community. Sometimes there are benefits that the state provides that certain neighborhoods or communities are shut out of, and I will work to make sure that that's not the case. Many of the criminal laws and the consequences for crimes and the ways that we deal with public safety are state laws and require a close analysis of how we're going to make sure that they are designed to keep all of our residents safe and that they stand up to the public safety challenges that Chinese residents are providing. Chinatown is one of the most important neighborhoods in San Francisco. So many people come and visit the neighborhood that it fuels a lot of our economic activity, jobs, businesses, and services for our entire city and especially for the Chinese community. So it is essential that it receives our strong support and resources. There's a few things that need to happen. One is we have to make sure that we address issues around safety. We have to make sure that there's enough policing in Chinatown, that people feel safe in the neighborhood and to come to the neighborhood. That is key and something that I focused on as the chair of the Budget and Finance Committee, and we'll have to provide additional support from the state level. Another big thing is the small businesses. The small businesses there have been struggling. I would like to see more investments, more grants, more subsidies, more assistance from the state for our small businesses so that they can thrive and get through what is continuing to be a recovery period. There are a lot of people who have not started to visit Chinatown again because the tourism hasn't come back. So they really do need our extra support right now. In addition to that, Chinatown is such a destination. It's a destination for people in the city who have to travel to Chinatown. I want to make sure that the buses and the transit is really strong to Chinatown from all across the city, including from right here in Visitation Valley. It was a big priority for me to restore the rapid transit that connects the southeast part of our city to Chinatown. That will be very important to me. But on top of that, we have to invest in the cultural and arts and tourism that bring people to Chinatown. That includes the theaters and museums and things that really put on display the history and culture of the Chinese community here in San Francisco.
Well, I think that Chinatown is still struggling because of the pandemic. You know, I think that a lot of businesses are still struggling, but I think that a lot of people who live there are having a hard time, you know, with the pandemic, you know, having access to healthcare, being able to afford the city, you know, and that's why, you know, what my opponent is proposing is so dangerous, right? Because, you know, he's saying he's going to build 100,000 units of new housing, and a lot of that's going to be luxury housing. To do that, he's going to have to like demolish a lot of existing housing, right? So is that going to be buildings in Chinatown? You know, who lives in those buildings? You know, Is it seniors, low-income seniors? And I can tell you that a lot of the people that are funding that campaign are big money developers that want to buy these buildings to build luxury housing in these buildings, and that could be very dangerous, right? Because it means the tenants who live in these low-income housing units could be pushed out, could be kicked out. And I know that the Chinese community, the Chinatown community has been fighting against that, and that's the tension in this campaign, that you have people who have a lot of money who just want to build luxury housing and want to take over these buildings in these neighborhoods. And what we're saying is, let's protect these neighborhoods. Let's make sure that low-income people, low-income residents can live in these neighborhoods, because these are their neighborhoods, and that's what this campaign is about, is protecting them, and I'm going to fight for them to make San Francisco more affordable. I'm going to fight for them to make San Francisco safer.
I'm very committed to being a champion for the Chinese community, to being accessible, to being visible, to delivering when there are challenges that people experience in accessing support or resources from the state. They can come to my office and I will fight for them. And that I will also work on the issues that I know are most important to the Chinese community. That's public safety and crime. That's housing and the cost of housing. It's public education and higher education. It's support for our small businesses. These are things that are going to be my priority, and I have a track record, I think, that distinguishes me from my opponent, and I very much hope to have your support on the election coming up and happening right now. We definitely plan to hire Chinese-speaking staff and to be very visible and connected here. I will be in Sacramento a few days a week, but I will still live in San Francisco, and I'll make sure to be out at community events, that people can access me through my office, that I will work with the media to get our message out, and that we will be a very accessible, visible, and accountable office, and I will be as your representative.
This campaign is not about me, it's about you. I may not be Asian, I may not be API, but I understand your experience. And I am running because I believe that an immigrant like me is needed to represent the interests of our communities. I'm going to be someone who's going to fight for you, who's going to fight to make sure that you have housing that is affordable, to make sure that we have an education system that gives opportunity to all of our students, that we have an economy that creates jobs for all of us, and that we prioritize small businesses. You're going to have in me a champion for you. Someone who's going to be advocating for the API community at every step, because it's personal to me. The API community is part of my family. So in that sense, it is very personal to me, and I hope you give me that opportunity. I think that it is important to have someone who comes from an immigrant background in this role at this time in the history of San Francisco.